Welcome to the Balance Sheet. I'm your host and student, Conrad Chua. I'm very happy to have with us today Dr. Angus Finney, a global film and entertainment business specialist. He's also an author and executive producer, and very close to our hearts, he teaches here in the Cambridge Judge Business School to our MBA students. He's also a coach on one of our concentrations, a recent hot off the press. It's been renamed Creative Industries in the Digital Age, right? Did I get that right, Angus?
Yep, that's
There we go.
correct. Yep.
Yes. And Angus has just written a book called Humans in the Loop about the impact and the usage of AI, generative AI in the filmmaking world, in the creative industries. So, Angus, could you tell us a bit about why did you write this book?
Sure. Thanks a lot for having me on the program, Conrad. Um, about 3 years ago, I started to pay a lot of attention to AI, Gen AI in particular, and the industry I've worked in for more than 3 decades. And I started to realize rather than just being another kind of digital disruption, that actually my suspicion and sort of critical analysis was that AI was going to be here to stay, but also that it was going to be fast moving and the kind of applications and usages were going to be, if you like, on a very sharp level of change. So it's going to be constantly twirling in terms of what was available for filmmakers to be able to use, both in terms of tools, but also suites, and of course how inputs were going to need to match outputs. So I am not a technically kind of gifted or digital expert at all. However, I decided that it was really important to roll my sleeves up and engage fully in AI. And as I speak to you today, I've got literally 30, 40 books on AI across my office desk. I'm in the middle of an academic paper, which has just been submitted with Dr. Allegra Hadida to AMD Journals of Discovery. I'm about to write a textbook on AI in the screen industries. And I felt that it was really important to get a chance to be able to use Michael Porter's framework of the value chain and the work that I've done on the independent film industry, and to look at AI from a point of view as a skin that wraps around the value chain, all the way from ideation and development through production and onto distribution and marketing and ultimately to audiences. It's a framework that I thought was really worth exploring through this kind of guidebook. And I pitched that to a group of bodies that are representative across Europe called Cine Regio. They support film funds and film agencies around the whole of the European continent. And they loved the idea. They said, okay, this is really useful. This is really helpful. It's quite practical. But at the same time, what they wanted was a level of critical analysis rather than just description of a range of tools. So I dug in and did a lot of research. I used some AI tools like Perplexity and ChatGPT to do a sort of a certain deep dive into some of the tools that are available. I used a lot of different secondary resources, and then I also spoke to a lot of filmmakers. And the result was something published earlier this year that has caused quite an interesting stir. It's caused quite a lot of attention. I've been asked to give a keynote in Brussels later this year. I've been talking at Berlin and Gothenburg at the film festivals about AI around some of the themes of the book, and it's been widely disseminated across the industry.
So, Angus, you say that AI is like the skin that goes over the various parts of the filmmaking process. Does that mean that you think the industry as a whole is not going to, the components of the industry are not going to change very much, but AI will just lift all the different parts of it? It won't be that kind of seismic change?
There are certain key elements when you put, for example, a feature film together that are unassailable. And in the kind of entertainment industry as elective and the work that I've done on the film industry, they still remain constant and present. And those five key elements are the script, the director, the producer, the budget, and the cast. And those 5 key elements are effectively enshrined in any sort of organization around the project management sort of challenge, and those remain constants. What I'm interested in is the fact that obviously AI and the array of different types of tools and inputs and possibilities that it raises have a potential impact on each of those roles and each of those elements, sometimes in a varying level of effect. In other words, I would argue that some of the areas of the value chain are much more impacted directly by AI and Gen AI in particular, and others are more debatable or open to human judgment and adoption. That's what I would suggest. Yeah.
Mm. And to our viewers on this live webinar who are watching this live, if you've got any questions for Angus, please put them in the Q&A box. But Angus, would it be fair to say that then one area that people are in the film industry that people are concerned about the impact would be the screenwriters, and that's why they went on strike? Is that why?
Yeah, I think clearly when it comes to creative skills, and when it comes to certain types of tacit skills, such as screenwriting, both for film and high-end TV drama, these are quite sensitive areas where there are levels of craft that AI made a number of, and certainly the 5 horsemen of the techpocalypse made a number of assumptions and assertions that AI was somehow going to be an incredibly important component when it came to ideation and the art of writing. Actually, what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years is significant limitations of what AI can and can't do. When it comes to ideation, it's been really interesting to talk to writers about a varying level of usage. Some writers have used it as a sounding board, as a kind of an assistant to be able to test out different types of storytelling ideas, story plots, story subjects, character development. But very often in the interviews that I've done with writers, they've gone so far with some little bit of large language model support and then dropped it and moved on. So they've used it, if you like, as a backdrop to their R&D process rather than something that's driven their ideation all the way through to the point of screenwriting. And then as we've seen across the media and a lot of different analysis, that large language models are predictive models. They're based obviously on a large amount of scraping and training, what's called the common crawl. And they are effectively guessing or predicting the next word. Now, when you get to craft writers who really understand a lot about story structure and character, there's a level of human lived emotions and experience that is deeply resonant in really powerful storytelling that a predictive AI, large language model, I don't think at this stage of the development of AI and its tech abilities can ever at the moment match. That's my view and my experience from having talked to many, many screenwriters and directors in the film and TV industry.
So what are some areas in film production that you think AI can really make a positive difference?
I think I'm going back to that theme of being a skin around different elements of the value chain. What I've been really impressed by is the automation and the augmentation of AI tools when it comes to pre-production, production, and post-production. If you like, the heart of the actual practical filmmaking stages. And I think it's really interesting when you look at pre-production, for example, and you look at things which AI tools are able to engage with, which are data-driven. So things like breaking down a script into a schedule that marks out how many days a film is going to take to be able to make, how that schedule then gets broken down into a budget, and you need those 3 documents to be able to get an accurate budget, not just jumping from a script to a budget. I think AI tools there, like Kalia and others that I mentioned in Human in the Loop, are really valuable for line producers, production managers, and for producers who take the lead on projects. these are very useful tools, especially in pre-production. Things like locations and studio budgeting, that kind of R&D research that can be not necessarily always speeded up. It's not necessarily always a case of so-called efficiency, but it's a supportive tool that can be able to cut a certain amount of both time and manpower, which of course, at the same time as saying, is a threat to the industry, because obviously people who have been used to being employed as location managers, as studio assistants, etc., or as assistant producers, find that the AI tools are effectively cutting them out of some of their water cooler learning moments, their junior jobs. And that is an interesting aspect of both in pre-production and production, where AI might be more threatening to the ecosystem of the workforce. But having said that, I still believe that across production and pre-production, there are definite uses. The big area, Conrad, is in post-production. Now, post, as we all know, those who are familiar with the film and TV industry, has for the last 20 years or more been actively engaged with digital technology and all sorts of different CGI, SFX tools. There's no secret there. But what I found really interesting in post-production were the kind of creative technologists who are knee-deep in exploring what different types of AI suites and AI tools can do, and being able to use these tools to be able to draw out of a film director or a storyteller, an artist, what's really inside their head more quickly, more efficiently, with very, very quick sort of proxies, which is able to be demonstrated and brought to life by Gen AI tools in a way that is really interesting in comparison to the heavy sort of 10-ton pencil that the film industry has sort of suffered from in post-production in particular. So I think that element of genuine efficiency, where you're able to bring visual images to life much more quickly, to be able to test, stress test them, to QC, to be able to explore, is really interesting. And then there's an array of post-production elements around sound, music, obviously the editing process, which definitely has been proven to be well supported by AI. But I would argue, just as the title of the book implies, that these need to be, if you like, managed and directed by humans rather than allowed to kind of go AWOL. The crucial point here is human judgment and constantly being aware of getting inputs that match the intended outputs. And that to me is incredibly important. But I see that whole area of pre-production, production, and post as a very rich area that AI tools are definitely being able to support, be collaborative when we look at co-piloting, the ability of humans to be able to work very cleverly and closely with AI. And there's some fantastic work being done there, where there's what I call the notion, and it's used quite a lot around AI analysis, of alignment between humans and the tools. That to me is a sort of sweet spot where I can see the industry working well with AI as a supportive tool. Yeah.
Yeah. So as somebody who's never been on a film set, and my only experience with like post-production is that's like downloading video from my phone, from my camera, and then using Final Cut Pro and slicing stuff really badly. Tell us, how are people using AI in this sort of post-production editing with sound, with music, and obviously the raw footage?
So I think what's really interesting, when you talk to editors about AI and the kind of toolkits that they're able to work with, and when you're trained, which I had to go and get organized so that I understood how not just Midjourney works, but also obviously the art of the prompt, very specific, quite significant prompting at scale. And then you look at some of the really interesting suite work with Leonardo, for example, and Da Vinci, the really wonderful kind of suites that are able to join up different ranges of different types of AI tools. What's really interesting is that editors are able to play and use with these tools to be able to generate images and to be able to copy images and to be able to augment images much more quickly than they ever were before, with a lot more flexibility. than they were under the traditional kind of editing protocol. That, to me, is interesting as long as that editor is very clear, along with the director, of what they are actually seeking to achieve, rather than getting distracted by the enormous, if you like, sweet shop in post-production of different choices and different explorations that you can go down. There's a danger of going down the rabbit hole in post-production. So my sense is that there's been some resistance, just to answer your question in a bit more detail, about post-production and directors and editors working in suites. And it's really interesting that quite a lot of the pushback from the industry is not to adopt into, for example, runway suites for editing, but to want to cherry pick very bespoke tools that they feel comfortable working with, and putting, if you like, their own array of different types of editing AI-supported tools, rather than being locked into one type of suite. So there's something about the creative judgment and choices that people want in post, which is to be able to have a certain amount of agency and selection, a bit like shot selection when it comes to a DOP shooting a film. They also want AI gen tool selection rather than being locked into one kind of suite or program. So on the one hand, they're supportive and they're efficient and they're playful. On the other hand, they can also be quite deeply disruptive in the sense of misdirection. And of course, certainly sometimes getting into the stages where they do not necessarily generate images or effects or work that is what the director actually intended. So what I'm seeing in my research is a certain fragmentation of adoption, where there's an unequal and uneven level of knowledge, understanding, if you like, confidence and skill sets across these different tools. So you're finding that a very smart editor using an array of different types of AI tools won't necessarily be on the same page as a director who might be in different demographic, might be much older, might not have engaged with these tools. And you can see some disconnection here in not just the structure of the value chain, but also, if you like, in the creative elements that are being generated from this. And that is a concern. And that brings us obviously to the point about upskilling, training, and what I call sort of AI knowledge. It's not just a case of the tools being understood, but it's also a deeper understanding that I think we all owe it to ourselves to understand in a critical, analytical kind of sense of where AI comes from, how it's built, where it can work, and where it has issues and creates challenges. So that unevenness, Conrad, is quite important to be aware of, because even at the highest level of Hollywood studios or streaming kind of big budget dramas, I'm still seeing a level of uneven adoption, uneven understanding, uneven knowledge, fragmented kind of applications, rather than something that's become neatly systemized. Yeah. So that it's creating quite a lot of imbalance, and that of course creates a certain amount of creative tension, where people don't feel that they're all on the same page.
So currently there's this controversy over Will Smith's concert video, where apparently, we still don't know, but there's a lot of speculation that it was AI. They used AI to generate all these crowd footage to make the crowds look more emotional, much more enthusiastic. And I find that very interesting, because Will Smith 2 years ago, there was this very famous AI generated meme of Will Smith eating spaghetti, and it was really bad. But obviously technology has gone up, has improved so much. So Angus, do you think, based on what you say, this uneven adoption, do you think that there's actually going to be directors or film studios who are going to be sucked into this sweet shop, as you say, and just go full in on this AI, and it becomes this produce AI slop in movies?
I think the AI slop kind of threat, if you like, is already here in our much wider kind of media context. It's worth noting to the audience that more than 50% now of internet images and information are now generated by bots. It's literally just switched over from being less than 50% to more than 50% in the last 3 months. So we're already surrounded by a huge amount of AI-generated information and images on a daily, hourly, minute-by-minute basis. Then I think we need to look carefully at what we're really talking about in this discussion, which is the film industry. Feature films are demanding. They are often seen over the last 120 years as the highest form of, if you like, sort of art. They are expensive. They're costly. Even in the independent market, films cost more than $1 million or $2 to make, up to maybe 10, 15, 20 million in the independent non-Hollywood market. They cost, as we all know, 100 to 150 to 250 to sometimes half $1 billion to make and market and promote at the Hollywood or streaming level. So we're dealing with a huge amount of risk. We're dealing with a lot of sunk costs. And with that comes a level of quality control. Now, quality, of course, has a range of different nuances and understandings. But I think what's interesting when we talk about slop, what we're dealing with at the moment is a level of digital kind of material that's being, if you like, easily available and pushed across the net. Then we look at advertising, and we look at the advertising and commercials industry, where they have been one of the earliest adopters of AI tools. And if you like, to use your expression, they're all in the sweet shop. They're all in trying to work out how to use these tools, how to apply them, how to make ads cheaper, how to make them quicker, how to make them more efficient. And effectively, they are like part of the R&D of hardcore exploration of what can and can't be done with AI whilst still engaging the user. Now, there's been quite a lot of pushback on advertising and adverts. We know the Coca-Cola Christmas advert, for example, was an absolute disaster when people found out that it was Gen AI initiated, and that was a really interesting pushback from audiences' comfort zone. And then we've also seen, some of the pushback of crowds and big sloppy use of AI-generated images of multiple actors or stroke bodies, stroke characters. There's no question, Conrad, that there's an expression from the 1970s from a Japanese academic, which is called the uncanny valley. The uncanny valley is when we as humans look at images and we think that and feel instinctively in our gut and instincts that there's something wrong with them, that there's a fake element to them. And you can probably get away with some of that when it comes to internet traffic. You can probably get away with some of that when it comes to advertising, although the bar is a little higher. But when it comes to feature films and high-end drama, suspending our disbelief requires a considerable amount of authenticity and craft and care. So this notion that there's going to be a gold rush towards mass, use of Gen AI tools in a non-judgmental, non-kind of crafted manner, that we're going to be suddenly subjugated to huge amounts of Gen AI written, directed, and produced content. That, I don't think, is going to happen. I think even Ted Sarandos and some of the other studio heads have been very clear that they still feel that humans are at the center of the loop. And Ted is on record, being very clear that he's aware that the QC, the quality control required, and the creative inputs required for high-end drama and films is of a different nature to what we might accept flying around our internet screens today. So I think there's a little bit of discernment, and I use that word judgment advisedly, of what will actually pass, not just pass, but excel when it comes to feature film making. I often see these things as very emotionally driven, if you like, sort of conduits. When we watch a film, we are normally actually watching a film to be emotionally moved, whether it's horror, scared, whether it's comedy, laugh out loud, whether it's action adventure, or a thriller, sitting on the edge of our seat. These are very emotive emotions, and they effectively, in a dark cathedral of a cinema, bind us together in that kind of shared experience. Any kind of effects or spectacles that take us out of being immersed in that experience are a danger and a risk. So again, the trial and error of working out what kind of AI tools work and what kind of AI tools actually misdirect or become a threat to that immersive experience are very interesting. And I don't think we're there yet. I think there's a lot more R&D and a lot more experimentation to be done. Because as you can tell, I'm not against the notion of experimenting and using these tools, just as we've used some extraordinary tools around digital CGI, SFX in the last sort of 20 or 30 years. What I am concerned about is what I think is a move actually almost sideways to what I call the age of authenticity, where people are beginning to become very aware and sensitive to the uncanny valley and to the slop that's around us, and start to apply a little bit more critical judgment, especially when it comes to paying a ticket price or a subscription to a service that if you like, disappoints or confuses you rather than supports that emotional engagement that you're looking for from really great filmmaking, you know?
Mm, mm. So why do you say it's a move sideways into the age of authenticity?
Well, when we talk about authenticity, a lot of people talk about, nostalgia. They talk about, the old Sony sort of Walkman, or they talk about vinyl and the rise of vinyl again. They talk about physical media that we can hold in our hands and that we could collect and we can put on shelves and that don't get lost in the cloud or suddenly getting a notice from Netflix saying, this program will no longer be available to you in 10 days' time. So this idea that nostalgia and physical media has a role. And if you talk to students, even MBAers that I've been teaching and training for the last 10 years, they also have an interesting respect for things that we can collect, and in fact are not necessarily digital kind of natives who love the idea of everything being stored in the cloud. When I say sideways, what I'm talking about is there's a sort of sense of, and this is an expression that sort of I came up with, there's a neo-Luddite kind of sense of, well, people who are into old media are effectively not embracing change, and they're not dealing with the challenges of the digital age. Actually, there are strengths in both. There are strengths and understandable kind of touch points when we collect things that we value and we want to store them, or we experience them in a different way because they have a different kind of value to us, or they have a different resonance and depth in the way that we actually experience them on a screen. When you see a DVD or even a Blu-ray, in comparison to something which has been streamed, on a train, on an unstable internet connection. So I'm interested in the fact that we live in a multiplexed sort of world, where there are a number of different types of ways that we consume, experience, and absorb different types of experiences on screen entertainment. So when I say sideways, I don't want to be caught in the trap of going backwards, but to acknowledge, if you like, a diversity of different types of experiences. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, I can totally empathize with that because I listen to lots of music on streaming, and I've gone back to some albums that I really like, and then suddenly the music seems a bit different because now it's a deluxe edition, and I always feel like I'm being gaslit because I'm thinking it did sound different, but I can't find it anywhere, right? So I take your point. Um, in your book, you have 20 thesis points on AI management. If you were
Yeah.
to get into Ted Sarandon's office and you only have 5 minutes with him, what are 3 things that you will tell him that he needs to do this year about AI?
So the first thing that's really key, I think, and it's not necessarily just for Ted, but I think it's for all managers, and if you like, although they're not exactly the same, leaders, is this notion of responsible AI. I think when you go back to the strikes that you mentioned earlier, and you look at the way that management approached the strikes with the Writers Guild of America and then the SAG-AFTRA Actors Guilds, you look at the way that they opened their salvos with a complete disrespect for engaging in the actual points of concern. And the offer, and this is exactly what they offered an annual digital conference to discuss advancements in Gen AI and AI, an annual conference. That was their opening salvo. And then we moved on to Bob Iger talking about, the fact that he felt that the unions were being irresponsible and unrealistic about their pay demands and concerns over AI. At the same time that week, as he was offered another 40 million for his paycheck and shares at Disney. You look at that kind of hubris and you think, this is seriously a problem. So I have a real concern about some of the managers and leaders paying lip service to what we call ethical AI, but not actually engaging with responsible AI. And there are now frameworks, very important frameworks, that a number of different bodies have put together, which define and are very clear about how responsible AI works. And it's not just a tick list of so-called ethics or codes of conduct. We all know those can be broadly claimed and very vaguely adopted. And often they're sort of self-regulated and not very enforceable. But I like the idea of responsible AI being a transparent and binding and potential kind of bridge building between managers, employers, managers and users and customers, one which is much more clear about responsibilities around AI content generation, information sharing, and decision making. And I think that framework is really key. The second, and I've mentioned this before, but I think it's incredibly important, I don't actually think that any organization is really about just bringing in experts to teach you how to use the tools. I don't think that's the key. I think the key is actually we all need to understand much more about AI itself as a technology, its history, the way that it can be and can't be used, the way it tends to veer around different types of applications. It's not just about learning about hallucinations and risks. It's also understanding embedded biases and problems that it might engender. And around that, in training and upskilling, understanding, most importantly, garbage in, garbage out, and of course the importance of privacy and dirty data. So around training and upskilling, it's very interesting around this, Conrad, because in addition to Human in the Loop, I recently co-wrote a big report on the screen sector and Gen AI for the British Film Institute with a couple of other authors. And at the launch at the South Bank in London, I asked the audience of about 150 researchers and academics and high-end sort of AI experts, how many of you actually paid for formal training and skills in AI over the last 3 years? And 3 hands went up. How many of you are self-taught? And 140 hands went up. It was a really interesting moment where you saw how we're still very ad hoc and if you like, quite sort of self-starting when it comes to AI. My sense about this is that this is a risk and a danger when you have a huge amount of workforce people still using private chat GPT sets and memberships rather than understanding what it means to share data, to share information, and the possibility of that actually being a threat to your own organization. So around training and upskilling, and it really comes down to the link between training and upskilling and responsible AI, I would argue that every single person in any organization needs to be properly upskilled and properly trained on a regular basis, because of course we know that it's changing. The last one is much more around creativity. My sense here, and it's interesting to think about this, before we did this podcast, I was thinking about what the creative ecosystem looks like. And the film and TV industry worldwide is actually not really organized around high-end, sort of top-heavy organizations. It's actually organized around project management. Each film and each television program, each documentary, even live format shows are projects, effectively. And you have project managers, often called producers, who are responsible for delivering that project. So one key thing around, I think, if I was back to Ted in the room at Netflix, is the importance of creative autonomy. True talent is a flight risk. Highly creative humans have tacit and transferable skills, and actually so do curators and arbiters of quality and taste. My sense is we need to balance, AI recommendations and data-driven implementation with this vision of filmmakers, storytellers, and creative project managers. And I think having a strategy around autonomy, enabling creatives to make their own choices rather than a top-down sort of efficiency drive of how everyone should be encouraged to work with the newest, most efficient, fastest tools is a huge mistake. The notion that great films were made because, as part of a process that was all about speed and efficiency is rubbish. I mean, that's complete bullshit. You go back to the great films made in the last sort of century, many of them took months, sometimes years. Many of them in my business now today take at least 5 years to go from ideation to an audience. So this notion that you can somehow upskill people to make it much more efficient and cost effective and engage a sort of drive towards return on investment is effectively going to kill the golden goose. So creative autonomy and support of your creatives and meaningful creative work. Meaningful is very interesting. That word meaningful comes up a lot in academic essays about Gen AI adoption, augmentation, and automation. Meaningful creative work, I think, lies at the heart of this in terms of great storytelling and entertainment. So my sense is that that third element is one that also needs to be part of the conversation.
Obviously,
So those are my
you mentioned TED. Yeah. So
yeah.
maybe you get another 10 minutes with TED. And obviously, Netflix has a huge amount of user data at their disposal. They know exactly what I watch, what you watch, how long you watch it for. Do you see AI coming into the programming side where Netflix can see from user data that, oh, actually, we just want yet another Superman movie, right? So let's go into that. Do you think that's a good thing or something that we should be aware of?
I think there's a real risk as we look at highly algorithmically driven platforms and offers, ranging from TikTok to YouTube to Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, etc. A lot of them are, we all know, are heavily gauged towards algorithmic recommendations based on a large amount of collected data. We also see that a lot in other types of programming and a lot of other types of clickbait. It's happening all the time. There's some really interesting research I did before I kind of really got into the weeds on Human in the Loop around Kyle Chakra. Kyle Chakra is a very experienced researcher who also writes for the New Yorker magazine. And he published a couple of years ago a book called Filter World. And Kyle researched and has written brilliantly about this phenomenon of homogenization and a flatlining of our choices. This idea that we're being driven towards more of the same. And this is a theme that you might think, okay, so that's one researcher and that's an interesting aspect, but who else is following that? If you look very carefully at MIT's tech review, technological review over the last 2 years, it's also done some really interesting research on Spotify, on the push and, if you like, outputs of algorithms and our narrowing of choices. And MIT is very interesting that they're concerned here that if we're guided and driven into a narrow set of choices, we become increasingly limited and veer away from a growth mindset and actually experience less choice rather than more. So the other concern, and this is a really important one that I would hammer into Ted in his high C-suite office, is that actually algorithms mitigate against risk. They don't support new talent and voices and formats because they're not supported per se by historical data sets. So you have a very big problem here of the virtual circle actually being short-circuited because algorithms are effectively working on what has gone before. So when we talk about predictive models, when we talk about predictive commissioning models, predictive financing models, we're in real trouble here because actually you're starting to shift into a narrow set of choices and a bar and a barrier to entry that's almost impossible to get over unless we're prepared to embrace risk and experimentation. So that is my concern about the AI, very heavily AI-powered algorithmic kind of networks and data sets that are out there. It's not just our choices, but it's also our choices for tomorrow, and who will be taken and given the opportunities and take a risk. It's one of the reasons why the independent film industry is so interesting, because of course it is less programmatic. It's less dependent on a centralized commissioning model, such as Netflix or Disney. It tends to be a jigsaw puzzle of different tastemakers and financiers and distributors who get behind independent films around the world. Doesn't matter whether you're in India or in Southeast Asia, China, or in Europe or the US indie market. There's always a range of components rather than one commissioning editor to say yes or no. And that to me is interesting, because algorithms have a much less detrimental effect on choices and risk when it comes to the independent market. Hence, there's a breeding ground in indie film that is not apparent in the streaming and studio models. And they, as we all know, have fed, if you like, the directors, the storytellers, the great writers and producers of tomorrow. If you switch that breeding ground off through complete dependency on ROI driven by algorithms, you go back to my argument previously, which is you kill the golden goose. Right. So those are my concerns.
And then we're left with, yet another Spider-Man reboot.
Yeah, we're left with super slop. Yeah, not helpful.
Well, Angus, if I could just end with one last question. What would you give as career advice to the MBAs that you'll be teaching this year who might be interested in working in the film or creative industry, given what you're seeing in terms of AI adoption?
Well, despite all my concerns and critical analysis, I was uttered these 3 words about 3 years ago when I embarked on my AI odyssey by Terry Gilliam's co-writer, a guy called Tony Grisoni, who's won a range of awards and is a wonderful creative writer. And he said, adapt or die. In other words, it's essential that we engage with AI. We develop a serious knowledge of not just the tools, but understanding what drives it, how it works. And that to me is incredibly important. So I totally encourage full engagement with AI in terms of learning how to prompt, understanding how it has originated, where it's moving, playing and experimenting with the tools, understanding its opportunities, and being deeply critically aware of the risks and concerns and challenges, and also to be curious. I mean, I'm a big fan of Mo Gawdat's book, Scary Smart, where he writes about AI in the most interesting way, where we need to engage. And MBAs, I think, certainly over the last couple of years, we've had some great speakers around AI on the courses that I deliver at Cambridge, who take exactly that kind of mindset. It's potential growth. It has a lot of challenges. We need to be aware of the risks, but we also need to understand the rewards that are potentially there. But ultimately, for all MBAs, in dreams begins responsibilities, as the great Irish poet said, W.B. Yeats. So when we engage with something as powerful, and we also need to feel a deep sense of engagement and responsibility.
Wise words, Angus. And for a moment, I thought you were going to quote Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. But yes, I think it's a much more distinguished poet. But yes. Well, thank you so much for watching. And for those who will be joining the MBA, I hope that some of you will be inspired, interested to sign up for Angus's elective, or the concentration. So thank you all very much. And thank you, Angus.
Thanks very much, Conrad. Take care. Bye-bye, everyone.